Happy Friday, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on this edition of Business Daily. I'm Lee in Seoul. Before we get started, let's first get a quick check of today's highlights. Korea's consumer sentiment for November drops to the lowest level in almost 8 years on the back of growing uncertainties at home and abroad. Word has it that U.S. President-elect Donald Trump is going to pick a New York billionaire as his commerce secretary. We have these stories and more coming right up. Rising economic uncertainty sparked by the power abuse scandal here in Korea and the power transition in the United States have all pushed domestic consumer sentiment to levels not seen since the darkest days of the global financial crisis. Our Lee Min-young starts us off.
Korea's consumer sentiment dipped in the month of November to the lowest point in nearly 8 years. The Bank of Korea's Composite Consumer Sentiment Index for this month stands at 95.8, down more than 6 points from the previous month. The last time the related index was this low was during the height of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, when the figure stood at 94.2. The index is now below the benchmark 100 figure, which means pessimists outnumber optimists. It's also the first time in 5 months that the reading has fallen below the benchmark. The data also showed how consumers understand the current economic conditions has worsened, with a separate index on it sliding to 60 for November, down from 72 a month ago. This is also the lowest figure since March 2009, when the number stood at 34. An index measuring the public sentiment toward the future outlook on the economy showed they have less hope the Korean economy will bounce back to normal within the next 6 months, as the number is down 16 points from a month ago. How people perceive the health of the job market also tumbled. The index on employment sentiment slipped to 68 in November, down from 79 in the previous month. The downward trend comes on the back of amplified anxiety at home and abroad in light of the presidential corruption scandal and the incoming Trump administration, both of which have raised questions about the potential changes to come as a result. There are concerns that worried consumers will drastically cut back on their spending, especially on non-essential goods such as durables and clothing, into early next year. Lee Min-young, Business Daily.
Korea's top economic policymaker says the ongoing government-led corporate restructuring drive will require time and patience, but should proceed in a consistent manner to achieve the desired results. During a ministerial meeting that held on Friday morning, Finance Minister Yoo Il-ho urged patience with the restructuring process, which he said is being undertaken to rid the industry of bad practices. He added that the government is working out detailed plans for the country's shipbuilding, shipping, steel, and petrochemical sectors. Yoo said government ship orders to help local shipyards and the $5.5 billion plan to support local shipping firms will also be secured by year's end. And moving on to markets, to give us a wrap-up of this week's stock market action, we have our Business Daily's markets contributor, Choi Jin-seok, joining us on the phone today. Hello, Jin-seok.
Good afternoon.
All right, so as we close the week, how are things looking on the last day of trading?
On Friday, the Korean equity market didn't move much. The Kospi closed with a 0.1% uptick, while the KOSDAQ rose by 0.8% to close at 597. The Kospi index opened the session with a slight uptick thanks to foreign investors' stock buying, but it soon lost steam due to mixed pictures shown in different sectors. In particular, share prices of major construction companies mostly fell due to the Korean government's announcement to roll out stricter loan screening in the face of the country's mounting household debt. The KOSDAQ managed to stay in positive territory, helped by foreign investors. In general, movements on the Korean equity market were quite muted since the U.S. markets were closed for the Thanksgiving holiday.
Now, on a weekly basis, there was clearly a mixed picture between the Kospi and the KOSDAQ market. So how was the overall weekly performance?
That's right. On a weekly basis, the Kospi fell slightly, while the KOSDAQ plummeted by around 4%. Despite domestic political uncertainty, the Kospi index managed to minimize declines as both foreigners and institutions bought shares on a weekly basis. However, the Kosdaq market was hit the most due to the Chinese government's potential ban on Korean cultural content. By sectors, foreigners and institutions focused on steel, hardware, and motors, and sold shares in media, biotechnology, and consumer staples sectors.
And expectations for an economic rebound and more inflation have been lifting global financial markets, so investors are expected to pay quite close attention to market events related to future inflation expectations, right?
Exactly. First, the OPEC meeting held on Wednesday in Vienna will be key. There's hope oil producers will reach an agreement to cut production, but even so, what will be more important is how much they agree to cut in output. If the scale of production cuts meets market expectations, we can expect a greater rebound in global oil prices. China's manufacturing data and U.S. inflation data will draw a lot of attention too. If there are signs of economic recovery in the so-called G2 countries, investors will have more conviction in future inflation. It has been Choi Jin-seok for Business Daily.
Korean tech giant Samsung Electronics is tightening its grip on the global DRAM market, hitting a record high in terms of global market share. Market tracker DRAM Exchange says Samsung's global market share stood at almost 65% during the July to September period. The company's sales in the sector rose more than 22% from the second quarter to nearly $3 billion. Samsung's use of 20-nanometer processing technology in its mobile memory chips is seen as the driving factor behind its continued success. The technology improves wafer productivity and produces a semiconductor that consumes less power. It appears that Korea will have to brace for a potential economic aftershock as China, its biggest trading partner, looks to enforce more trade sanctions on products from sugar to chemicals and high-end electronics. Our Kim Jung-soo has this report.
Trade between Korea and China has increased exponentially over the years, with China currently accounting for over 25% of Korea's exports. But it appears that Korea will soon have to prepare itself for a drastic turn of events, as China is looking to strengthen its protectionist measures on several imports, especially through anti-dumping and safeguard duties. In fact, Korea's exports to China have been on a downward slide for 16 months straight, with each month basically setting a new low. It is worth noting, however, that from January to August this year, all of China's trade restrictions were in the form of non-tariff barriers, such as quotas, embargoes, and other sanctions. Beginning in September, however, China began investigating potential safeguard measures or a temporary suspension of imports on Korean sugar products, and in October began investigating the possibility of placing anti-dumping duties on a Korean chemical product made of polyoxymethylene, also known as acetal, that had taken the top spot in China's import market. And as recently as Tuesday, the Chinese government said it is planning to reopen its anti-dumping investigation into a Korean polysilicon product. That's not good news for Korean companies that have production lines in China, like Samsung SDI and LG Chemical. For one thing, China, which currently has the biggest market for electric vehicles, is seeking to enforce higher certification standards on companies that produce lithium-ion batteries. Companies must now have annual production capacities of 8 billion watt-hours of energy, which is 40 times more than the previous requirement of 200 million. At the moment, only 2 Chinese companies meet the standard, but if the Chinese government enforces it, Korean companies could be at a serious price disadvantage. Experts have said that China's protectionist measures reflect its intent to promote its domestic industries, and that despite ongoing speculation, it should not be seen as a response to Korea's deployment of the U.S. missile defense system, THAAD. Kim Jung-soo, Business Daily.
It's Friday, and that means it's time for a look through some global business stories from the week. For that, we're now joined by our Eunice Kim in the studio. Hello, Eunice.
Happy Friday.
All right, so Thanksgiving Day has just ended in the United States. And of course, it's a holiday that President-elect Donald Trump has probably spent thinking about who to pick as his candidates for his cabinet, right? And also, it seems that he's close to a decision on his Commerce Secretary.
Absolutely. And the Commerce Secretary, of course, would have a significant amount of say on America's posture on global trade, especially in the coming Trump administration. And today, reporting from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times are all pointing to billionaire private equity investor Wilbur Ross as the likely candidate. Wilbur Ross, who turns 79 on Monday, has been a close advisor to Donald Trump, helping him craft everything from trade, infrastructure spending, and corporate tax cuts when it comes to fiscal policies. Now, Ross himself had made a name for himself in the early 2000s as, quote, the king of bankruptcy. Now, he had bought and turned around many distressed companies, particularly steel and coal mining companies in America's Rust Belt, a region you'll remember that was key in pushing Trump to an election win. Ross is also no stranger to Asia, as he has cut deals both in Korea and Japan during the Asian financial crisis.
Now, U.S. steel and mining sectors are also hit by globalization. So what do we know about his opinions on free trade?
Sure. So Wilbur Ross was at the front lines of trying to save some of those big steel mill jobs, America's largest steel mills, while making billions in the process, I should add. But ultimately, he saw many of those jobs being shipped out to China and beyond, so he is certainly very familiar with the pain there. He had said this in an interview back in August. Free trade is like free lunch. There is no free lunch. Somebody wins and somebody loses, and unfortunately, we've been losing with these stupid agreements that we'd made. His words there. More recently, he told the Financial Times that he is not anti-trade, but believes that it's time America should, quote, treat ourselves as the world's biggest customer and treat nations that are selling to us as suppliers to us.
So in a sense, put America first, as Trump's campaign slogan has said. But what could this mean in a larger sense? I mean, China had already said that it's ready to step in as the global free trade leader if the United States is going to step away from doing that.
Right, and certainly Trump's recent video on YouTube announcing his plans to begin the process of pulling out of the TPP on day one of his presidency is not helping the U.S. on the geopolitical front. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, as we know, did not happen overnight. It took years of painstaking negotiations on what was supposed to be a new standard bearer on responsible trade, with considerations for elements like protections on labor and protections on intellectual property, enhancing innovation and preserving the environment, just to name a few. But with a single swipe of a pen, all that could become history. And many say that China, that had been on the sidelines watching on, as you know, they're not part of the TPP conversation, they are ready to fill a leadership vacuum. And here is China's Commerce Ministry spokesperson yesterday saying that Beijing will continue to deepen reforms toward the goal of developing a global economy.
Regardless of what direction the TPP or RCEP will take in the future, China will continue to focus on deepening reforms and further opening up. China will continue to closely work with World Trade Organization members and constantly strengthen the role of multilateral trade mechanisms in order to create a freer and more convenient environment for global trade.
And of course, China's got its own plans on multilateral free trade deals up its sleeves, right?
Right, and we're talking about RCEP here, as well as the FTAAP, and here's how they line up against TPP member nations. Now, all three trade talks began out of what was seen as a lack of progress within the umbrella of the World Trade Organization, and as you can see, RCEP, which is short for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, includes many countries like Australia, Japan, and Korea that were a part of the TPP talks. notably excludes the Americas, at least for now. Then there's FTAAP, or the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific. This is a vision for a regional economic bloc, which was first brought up among APEC countries in 2006. Now, while there's a ways before either trade pact comes to full force, we did hear from APEC leaders at the start of this week declaring their commitment to fight against protectionism. Very clear message there. We're already also seeing countries like the Philippines under President Rodrigo Duterte aligning themselves with China away from their traditional ally, the U.S. This as China's state banks are said to be pouring billions of dollars in investments into Latin American markets, presumably to exert soft power there. Meanwhile, we are hearing from the head of the World Trade Organization that he's received no notice from the next U.S. president of his intention to pull out of the trading body.
Well, for now, definitely a lot of changes on the trade front that we can expect as Donald Trump gets ready to come into office, right?
Yes, definitely, possibly big changes ahead.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
You bet.
And that wraps it up for today and this week. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be back next week with more business news that matters to you. Until then, goodbye.